My name is Dante Flint Blackwell, Wildlife Disease Specialist for the USGS. 48 hours ago, I was performing routine necropsies on infected wolves when civilization collapsed around me. Now I'm barricaded in a ranger station with my Hawk Sev, military helicopters circling overhead and hordes of infected closing in. I know what caused this zombie outbreak. The warning signs were there for weeks in the wildlife. No one listened. I might be immune. I might have the key to humanity's survival. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I never expected to make a broadcast like this. For those joining, my name is Dante Blackwell, though most colleagues call me Flint. Until 48 hours ago, I was a wildlife disease specialist with the USGS National Wildlife Health Center. Now, I might be one of the few people who understands what happened. What's still happening? I'm recording this from a secure ranger station deep in Yellowstone. The power's running on backup generators, and I've got enough supplies to last maybe a week. Sev, my red-tailed hawk, is perched by the window keeping watch. He's been with me since I rescued him during an avian flu outbreak 3 years ago. Funny how he might end up rescuing me now. If you're watching this, 2 things are true. You've survived the initial wave and communications are still functional somewhere. Both facts give me hope. My purpose in recording isn't just to document what I've seen, but to share critical information that might keep you alive. 3 days ago, everything was normal. I was doing what I always did, tracking potential zoonotic disease outbreaks in wildlife populations. My specialty is identifying when animal diseases show patterns suggesting they might jump to humans. I've been trained in containment protocols, field necropsies, emergency response, all skills that kept me breathing these past 2 days. I'd been in Yellowstone's backcountry for nearly a week, investigating unusual wolf deaths when things went sideways. The patterns weren't adding up. Wolves showing extreme aggression before death, attacking pack members, even engaging in cannibalistic behavior. The necropsies showed severe brain inflammation, but it didn't match any known pathogen in our database. What concerns me most is that I'd been seeing warning signs for weeks before this all exploded. Massive bird migrations out of season, predator species abandoning traditional territories, prey animals moving in erratic patterns. Nature was telling us something was wrong, but no one connected the dots, including me, until it was too late. The morning everything changed, I received a garbled radio call from headquarters about unusual incidents in the towns bordering the park. The dispatcher sounded stressed but provided no details, just instructed all field personnel to continue their work while they assessed the situation. That call likely saved my life. While others returned to base, I stayed in the field. By noon, all communications with headquarters went silent. My satellite phone showed no service, and emergency channels were either jammed or dead. I remember standing on a ridge, watching a massive exodus of birds darkening the sky. I've never seen anything like it. Thousands of birds from different species, all flying in the same direction, away from population centers. That's when I found Park Ranger Wilson, or what remained of him. His body was partially devoured, but the bite patterns weren't from any animal I recognized. The wounds were too precise, too methodical. Human teeth marks. I was cataloging his injuries when I heard movement in the tree line. It was Dr. Chen, my colleague who should have been at headquarters 30 miles away. He emerged from the woods with a jerky, unnatural gait. His eyes were clouded, skin pallid with prominent veins. Most disturbing was the complete absence of recognition or any human response when I called his name. He lunged at me with unexpected speed. I managed to evade him and put distance between us, but he kept coming. No verbal response to my shouts, no reaction to warning shots from my sidearm. When he finally cornered me against a rock face, I had no choice but to take the shot. Center mass, enough to drop any man. He stumbled back but didn't fall. It took a second shot to the knee to bring him down, and even then, he continued crawling toward me, dragging his useless leg. The behavior matched exactly what I'd been seeing in the infected wolves: the aggression, the persistence despite injury, the apparent lack of pain response. I knew immediately this was a worst-case scenario. Whatever had infected the wildlife had made the jump to humans, and it had done so with devastating efficiency. The infection presented in ways terrifyingly similar to fictional portrayals of zombies. But this was real, with biological mechanisms I was beginning to understand from my wildlife observations. I made the hard decision to avoid all population centers. Standard wildlife disease containment protocol is to isolate and establish a perimeter. In this case, I became my own perimeter. I took inventory of my resources: field equipment, medical supplies, tranquilizer gun with limited darts, my personal sidearm with 43 rounds, 3 days of emergency rations, water purification equipment, and most importantly, my research data and field testing equipment. I made for higher ground, using game trails instead of main paths, moving counter to typical evacuation routes. Years of tracking wildlife taught me how to move silently and leave minimal trace. I oriented myself toward the old fire watch tower on Ridge Peak, defensible, with clear sight lines and emergency communication equipment. On the way, I tried repeatedly to reach any official channel, CDC, emergency services, military frequencies, but picked up only fragments of emergency broadcasts. What I heard confirmed my fears. The situation wasn't isolated to Yellowstone. Terms like nationwide containment failure and quarantine zones overrun suggested whatever this was had already spread far beyond any controllable boundaries. When I reached the watchtower just before sunset, I secured the location and set up observation points. Through my binoculars, I could see fires in West Yellowstone and Gardner. No emergency response visible, just chaos. As night fell, I noticed movement in the meadow below, a small herd of deer moving in the same strange, disjointed manner I'd observed in Dr. Chen. They displayed the same aggressive behavior, occasionally attacking each other without provocation. This confirmed my worst theory. The pathogen affected multiple species across biological kingdoms, making containment virtually impossible using standard protocols. I spent that first night documenting everything I observed, cross-referencing with my previous wildlife data. The infection appeared to spread faster in humans than animals, suggesting it had adapted specifically to our biology. The incubation period seemed short, possibly hours rather than days, and transmission appeared to require direct fluid contact, most commonly through bites. By dawn, I had developed preliminary theories about the infection's nature. My background in zoonotic diseases told me this was likely a prion-like pathogen with viral transmission characteristics, something that rewired the brain while hijacking cellular functions to replicate itself. The fact that it affected multiple species suggested a fundamental attack on mechanisms common to all vertebrate neural systems. What terrified me most wasn't the infected themselves, but how perfectly designed this pathogen seemed for maximum spread. The aggressive behavior, the lack of pain response, the drive to bite, all served its transmission. Either this was the result of an extraordinary evolutionary leap, or something much more troubling. As the first light broke over the mountains, I made my decision. I needed to reach the research facility at Mammoth Hot Springs. If any of my colleagues had survived, they'd go there. More importantly, the facility had equipment that could help me analyze samples and potentially develop countermeasures. I gathered my gear and plotted the safest route through backcountry, using my knowledge of wildlife migration patterns to avoid likely infection hotspots. What I didn't know then was that the journey would bring me face to face with both the worst of humanity's collapse and the first glimmer of hope for its survival. I left the watchtower at first light, moving through the forest with every sense heightened. My pack contained only essentials: water, protein bars, medical supplies, ammunition, and most crucially, my research notes and testing equipment. Sev flew ahead, his presence acting as an early warning system. Birds of prey avoid infected animals instinctively. Their behavior patterns change when danger approaches. The route to Mammoth required crossing 15 miles of varied terrain. Under normal circumstances, I could cover it in a day. These weren't normal circumstances. I stuck to game trails and elevation changes that would be difficult for the infected to navigate. Their motor control seemed impaired, giving me an advantage on challenging terrain. About 3 miles in, I encountered my first evidence that the infection had spread beyond isolated cases. A family campsite, completely overrun. I won't describe what I found in detail, but I will say this: the infected don't consume their victims entirely. They bite enough to transmit the pathogen, then move on to the next target. Efficient, almost purposeful. I collected samples from the site: blood, tissue, soil. My portable field kit allowed for basic analysis, revealing something concerning. The pathogen was present in the soil where blood had soaked in. This suggested environmental persistence. The good news, if you could call it that, was that the soil samples showed significantly lower viral loads than direct tissue samples. The pathogen likely weakened outside a host. Midday, I heard helicopter rotors echoing through the valley. Military aircraft, flying in formation. Not search and rescue patterns, these were systematic grid sweeps. I observed through binoculars as they hovered over West Yellowstone. What happened next confirmed my suspicions about the government response. They weren't evacuating survivors. They were sanitizing areas. The firebombing was precise, contained, designed to create a perimeter. I've worked with enough government containment teams to recognize a quarantine zone being established. The helicopters moved methodically toward research facilities and infrastructure. They were securing or destroying sensitive locations. I adjusted my route to avoid open spaces where I'd be visible from the air. I couldn't be certain their orders distinguished between infected and uninfected. In containment scenarios this severe, sometimes the protocol is simply to reset the entire area. By mid-afternoon, I reached Lewis River. Crossing presented a dilemma. The water might slow or confuse infected, but it also limited my escape options. While scouting for a narrow crossing point, I noticed something in the water: dead fish, floating downstream in numbers I'd never seen outside major contamination events. Their gill tissue showed the same inflammation pattern I'd observed in mammalian brain tissue. The pathogen had reached the watershed. This changed everything. If it was waterborne as well as transmissible through direct contact, containment became virtually impossible. However, my testing showed the fish weren't carrying live pathogen. They had died from exposure, but the water itself didn't maintain sufficient viral load to transmit infection. Small blessing. I crossed at a shallow point and continued toward Mammoth, more determined than ever to reach the research facility. My notes contained observations about the disease progression that might be crucial for understanding transmission vectors. If other researchers survived, pooling our knowledge could be humanity's only hope. As dusk approached, I found myself in a densely wooded area near an off-trail backcountry campsite. I detected smoke, a controlled fire, not a wildfire. Someone was there, and they were being careful not to attract attention. I approached cautiously, using Sev as reconnaissance. When he returned to my arm calmly, I took it as a sign the people weren't infected. I announced myself from a safe distance, hands visible, voice low. 3 survivors emerged: a retired park ranger named Howard, his daughter Ellie, who worked park maintenance, and a tourist from Germany, Klaus. They had been hiding since watching a ranger station get overrun the previous morning. Their information filled crucial gaps in my understanding. The infection had hit populated areas first, spreading through emergency rooms and urgent care facilities. Patient 0 cases all reported animal bites or scratches before turning. The incubation period varied. Some turned within hours, others took nearly a day. Most importantly, they confirmed something I'd theorized. Not everyone exposed became infected. Howard had been bitten while helping others escape, but showed no symptoms beyond a normal wound infection that responded to antibiotics. This suggested natural immunity existed in some percentage of the population. We shared supplies and information, then debated our next move. They wanted to head for the designated evacuation point at Old Faithful Lodge. I explained what I'd seen from the military response and advised against it. Evacuation points would either be overrun or sanitized to prevent spread. My goal remained reaching the research facility. Klaus decided to join me, citing his background as a hospital administrator. He understood the value of medical research in a crisis. Howard and Ellie chose to continue to Old Faithful, believing safety lay in numbers. Before separating, we established a communication plan using emergency radio frequencies. As we prepared to part ways, Ellie mentioned feeling feverish. Howard insisted it was just exhaustion and stress. I recognized the early symptoms I'd documented in the wildlife cases: slightly elevated temperature, subtle motor tremors, increased light sensitivity. I pulled Klaus aside and explained my concerns. We agreed to move out immediately, leaving the father and daughter with additional medical supplies and clear instructions on wound care. I didn't tell them what I suspected. Perhaps that was wrong of me, but I'd seen how quickly the military contained infection sites. That night, Klaus and I camped in a rock formation that provided natural protection. He shared more about what he'd witnessed in the early hours, how hospital protocols broke down when staff began turning on patients, how quarantine measures failed when infected broke through barriers designed for compliant humans, not aggressive vectors. While he slept, I tested blood samples from our group. Howard's blood showed unusual antibody responses, confirming my immunity theory. Ellie's blood contained early-stage infection markers. Klaus was clean. My own sample revealed something I'm still processing: markers suggesting prior exposure, but no active infection. I've been exposed to dozens of zoonotic pathogens throughout my career. My system has encountered and developed responses to diseases most people never face. Could my prior exposures have created a partial immunity? More testing would be needed, but this discovery gave me the first real hope I'd felt since the outbreak began. At dawn, we heard screams in the distance, from the direction Howard and Ellie had traveled. We didn't investigate. We couldn't. The mission had to take priority over individual lives, something I've had to remind myself repeatedly over these past 48 hours. We moved out at first light, pushing harder toward Mammoth. The facility was just 7 miles away, and with it, equipment that could analyze our samples properly. If my immunity theory proved correct, we might have the building blocks for a treatment. Not a cure. I doubt this can be cured once symptoms manifest, but something to prevent infection in the healthy. What we found when we finally reached the edge of the Mammoth complex would change everything I understood about this outbreak. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Klaus and I reached the ridge overlooking Mammoth Hot Springs by mid-morning. The facility complex spread below us, eerily quiet. Through binoculars, I could see the main research building appeared intact, but the administrative offices showed signs of violence. Broken windows, a vehicle crashed through the visitor center entrance. No movement, infected or otherwise. We observed for a full hour before approaching. The infected tend to cluster where they turned, unless drawn elsewhere by stimuli. The absence of visible activity could mean the area was clear or that the infected had moved on following some attraction. Either way, we needed what was inside that lab. We descended using the maintenance paths rather than main roads, passing the famous terraced springs. The sulfuric smell that normally dominated the area was now mixed with something else, the distinctive copper tang of blood. Nature's stunning beauty contrasted with humanity's collapse in ways that still haunt me. As we neared the research facility, Sev became agitated, circling tightly above us rather than maintaining his usual scouting pattern. Something was wrong. I signaled Klaus to take cover behind a maintenance shed while I assessed the situation. Movement caught my eye, a figure in a Park Service uniform emerging from behind a vehicle. His movements weren't jerky enough to be infected, but something seemed off. I watched as he was joined by two others, all armed, all moving with purpose toward the research building. Looters, perhaps, or survivors like us seeking supplies. We faced a choice: avoid them entirely or make contact. Klaus argued for avoidance, reasoning that unknown humans posed potentially greater danger than the infected. The infected were predictable. Humans, desperate to survive, were not. I disagreed. If they were entering the research facility, they might damage equipment or samples we needed. We approached cautiously, announcing ourselves from a safe distance. The armed group immediately took defensive positions. Their leader identified himself as former Army Ranger Jackson, leading a small team searching for supplies. They had a camp established 5 miles out with 23 survivors. When I mentioned my specialty and purpose, Jackson's demeanor changed instantly. They weren't random scavengers. They were on a directed mission to secure research facilities and gather any information about the outbreak. Someone in their group had military intelligence background and believed this wasn't a natural outbreak. I shared my observations about wildlife infection preceding human cases. Jackson confirmed they'd received reports of unusual animal behavior from multiple survival groups across different regions, always preceding human outbreaks by days or weeks. This pattern suggested the infection originated from a single source and spread through wildlife corridors before reaching human population centers. Their group had already cleared the main research building and found it largely untouched. Most staff had evacuated when the first alerts came through, taking critical samples but leaving equipment behind. This was both good and bad news. The facility would have working lab equipment but potentially fewer research materials than I'd hoped. We formed an uneasy alliance. I would help analyze any samples they'd collected, and they would provide security while I worked. Klaus, with his hospital administration experience, proved invaluable in identifying useful medical supplies and organizing our scavenging efforts. Inside the research building, I found exactly what I needed: electron microscopes, centrifuges, PCR machines, and basic materials for blood and tissue analysis. The backup generator was still operational, giving us limited power. I immediately began processing the samples I'd collected, including my own blood. While working, Jackson shared more information from their intelligence sources. The outbreak had hit major cities simultaneously, overwhelming emergency services within hours. The military response focused on containing rather than curing, establishing quarantine zones, protecting critical infrastructure, and in some cases, implementing sanitization protocols for areas deemed unsalvageable. Most disturbing was his report that research facilities had become primary targets, not just for protection, but for destruction. The military was systematically eliminating certain labs and research centers, particularly those associated with agricultural biotech and zoonotic disease research. This matched the pattern I'd observed with helicopter movements. They weren't just containing the infected, They were erasing evidence. The question was, evidence of what? My analysis of the samples revealed something alarming. The pathogen resembled a modified prion disease with viral transmission characteristics, similar to chronic wasting disease in deer populations, but engineered for cross-species infection. The protein misfolding created cascading neurological damage, while preserving basic motor functions and amplifying aggression centers in the brain. This wasn't a natural mutation. The precision of its design, particularly its ability to infect across species barriers while maintaining core transmission characteristics, suggested deliberate engineering. Someone had created this, and based on the military response, they were now trying to cover their tracks. I kept this conclusion to myself while continuing to work. If Jackson's group had military connections, I couldn't be certain which side they served. Trust had become as precious a commodity as clean water. By evening, I'd confirmed my immunity theory. My blood showed antibodies effectively neutralizing the pathogen. Howard's blood sample showed similar properties, though less pronounced. I began separating the effective antibodies, hoping to develop at least a rudimentary treatment protocol. Jackson's team had established a secure perimeter around the facility, giving us what felt like the first safe moment since the outbreak began. Klaus and I used the opportunity to inventory supplies and plan next steps. If I could develop even a basic prophylactic treatment, it would need to be reproduced and distributed. That required more equipment and supplies than we had access to. As night fell, Jackson called us to the roof for a situation assessment. From that vantage point, we could see fires burning in distant towns. More concerning were the helicopter formations moving methodically across the landscape, following what appeared to be a search pattern centered on research facilities like ours. We needed to evacuate before morning. Jackson's team had secured several vehicles with enough fuel to reach their larger camp. The plan was to move out before dawn, taking essential equipment and my research notes. I insisted on bringing the antibody samples. They represented our best hope for developing treatment. While preparing for evacuation, Klaus discovered a locked server room in the basement level. Jackson's team hadn't managed to access it, but Klaus recognized the security system from his hospital work. Using administrative override codes that standardized across government facilities, he gained access to what appeared to be a secure data center. The servers contained research files dating back months, documenting a project called Agricultural Resilience Initiative. The bland name concealed its true purpose: developing biological control agents for invasive species that threatened crop yields. The researchers had been experimenting with modified prion structures that could target specific animal populations without affecting crops or humans. At least that was the intention. Email correspondence in the final days before the outbreak detailed concerns about unexpected mutation patterns in test subjects. Several researchers noted unusual aggression in laboratory animals, alongside ability to transmit between species that should have been impossible according to the original design parameters. The final messages included urgent warnings about containment failures and recommendations for immediate termination of all test subjects. Those warnings had been explicitly rejected by project administrators, citing productivity targets and delivery timelines. Corporate interests had overridden safety protocols. The pieces fell into place. This wasn't a natural outbreak or even a deliberate attack. It was corporate negligence amplified by government mismanagement. An agriculture project designed to protect food supplies had created the very thing that might end humanity. As I downloaded the server data, the facility's perimeter alarms activated. Jackson's team reported movement outside. Lots of it. The infected had found us, drawn perhaps by our lights or the generator noise. Simultaneously, one of their scouts reported helicopter activity moving in our direction. We were trapped between infected hordes and military sanitization. Our carefully planned dawn evacuation had just become an immediate emergency escape. With military and infected closing in from different directions, we had minutes, not hours, to gather what we could and find a way out. The research I'd managed to complete might hold the key to fighting this outbreak, but first, we had to survive the night. And I was beginning to suspect that the military's objective wasn't just containing the infected, but eliminating anyone who understood the outbreak's true origins. Jackson took charge as military training kicked in. His team split into defensive positions while Klaus and I frantically packed research materials and equipment. The infected were gathering at the main entrance, drawn by our activity, or perhaps the generator's vibrations. Their numbers grew by the minute, faces pressed against glass doors that wouldn't hold forever. We had 3 vehicles in the service bay, 2 Ranger trucks and a maintenance van. The plan was simple but desperate. Load the essential equipment, create a diversion to split the infected horde, then break through the thinnest point in their ranks. Meanwhile, we needed to avoid military detection, which meant no headlights and maintaining radio silence. I prioritized 3 items: my blood samples showing immunity markers, the extracted antibodies I'd begun processing, and the downloaded server data proving the outbreak's origins. Everything else was replaceable. Lives weren't. As we loaded vehicles, Jackson's communications specialist intercepted military chatter. The helicopters weren't just passing through, they had thermal imaging showing our heat signatures inside the building. We had perhaps 20 minutes before they reached us, and their orders were explicit. Sterilize the site. No survivors. Priority on research materials. The government wasn't just containing the outbreak, they were erasing evidence of its cause. One of Jackson's team, a former demolitions expert, suggested a solution to both problems. The facility's backup generator ran on propane tanks stored in an external shed. If detonated remotely, the explosion would draw the infected away from our planned exit route while creating enough thermal chaos to confuse military imaging systems. We finalized preparations as the infected began breaking through the main entrance. Their movements had become more coordinated than I'd previously observed. Not intelligent, but showing pack behavior. They focused attacks on structural weaknesses rather than dispersing their efforts randomly. The pathogen was evolving, adapting its hosts for more efficient spreading. Jackson assigned 4 of his team to create a barricade, buying us precious minutes. I didn't see those 4 again. Their sacrifice gave us the time needed to finish loading and position the vehicles for our escape attempt. The demolition expert rigged the propane tanks with a remote detonator, and we moved to the service exit furthest from both the infected concentration and approaching helicopters. On Jackson's mark, he triggered the explosion. The blast was more effective than anticipated. The propane ignited the facility's chemical storage, creating a cascading series of explosions that engulfed the entire north wing. Infected swarmed toward the flames, drawn by the stimuli. Our exit path cleared momentarily. We drove out in tight formation, maintaining distance from the flames while using them as cover from aerial observation. The plan worked until we reached the main road, where we encountered a military checkpoint that hadn't been there during our approach. Jackson made an immediate decision, veering off-road into terrain the military vehicles couldn't easily follow. We separated, taking different routes toward their camp rendezvous point. Klaus and I found ourselves alone in one truck, navigating backcountry trails I knew from years of wildlife tracking. We drove for hours in darkness, using natural landmarks for navigation. By dawn, we'd put significant distance between ourselves and Mammoth, but had no way to contact Jackson's group. Our agreed backup plan was to reach their camp independently, if separated. When daylight came, we stopped briefly to assess our situation. The truck had sustained damage from the rough terrain, a punctured radiator slowly leaking coolant. We had perhaps 2 hours of driving time before the engine would overheat beyond recovery. I used the pause to check our research materials. The blood samples were intact, as were the antibody extracts and data drives. I had enough equipment to continue basic analysis, but nothing like what I'd hoped to salvage from the facility. Something caught my attention while reviewing the server data, a reference to wildlife monitoring stations that had been part of the Agricultural Resilience Initiative. These unmanned research stations throughout the park contained specialized equipment for tracking wildlife disease spread. More importantly, they were designed for remote operation during quarantine scenarios. The closest station was near Canyon Village, within our vehicle's remaining range. If operational, it would have communication equipment, solar power, and possibly specialized research tools. It became our new destination. We arrived as the truck's engine finally gave out, steam pouring from the radiator. The monitoring station appeared untouched, a small, bunker-like structure nestled into the hillside, deliberately inconspicuous and far from tourist areas. The keypad entry required an access code. The server data included various security protocols, and after several attempts we found a maintenance override that granted access. Inside was exactly what we needed. A self-contained research outpost with satellite communication capability, solar power, and basic laboratory equipment. Most valuable was an advanced PCR machine specifically designed for field identification of wildlife pathogens. With this, I could analyze our samples more thoroughly and potentially develop a more refined treatment protocol. While Klaus secured our supplies and established a defensible position, I began processing the blood samples. The results confirmed my earlier findings but added crucial details. The antibody response wasn't just fighting the infection, it was adapting to target the specific prion structures. This suggested vaccine development might be possible with the right resources. I also discovered why some people showed natural immunity. Their blood contained elevated levels of specific proteins associated with certain autoimmune conditions. Howard likely had an undiagnosed autoimmune disorder that inadvertently protected him from infection. My own immunity stemmed from repeated exposure to similar wildlife pathogens, creating a broad-spectrum antibody response. The station's communication system allowed limited satellite connectivity. We established contact with Jackson's team, who had reached their camp with most of their group intact. They reported military search patterns had shifted, now focusing on these monitoring stations specifically. Our location wouldn't be safe for long. The satellite connection also provided brief access to emergency broadcasts. The situation nationwide was dire, but not apocalyptic. Certain regions had established effective quarantine zones. Military containment had succeeded in some areas, particularly less populated states with natural boundaries. The infection spread most rapidly in urban centers, creating hot zones where infection rates approached 90%. Most encouraging was news that several research facilities had reported limited success with treatment protocols similar to what I was developing. The CDC had established a secure research center in a remote mountain facility, gathering scientists with relevant expertise. If we could reach them with our data and samples, particularly the server information documenting the outbreak's origins, we might accelerate development of effective treatments. That evening, while continuing my analysis, I noticed something disturbing in Klaus's behavior. His movements had become subtly irregular, his speech occasionally halting. When I asked how he was feeling, he mentioned a headache that had begun hours earlier. I convinced him to let me take a blood sample, claiming routine testing for all of us. The results confirmed my fear. Early-stage infection markers, similar to what I'd seen in Ellie's blood. Klaus had been infected, likely during our escape from Mammoth. The disease progression appeared slower than typical cases, perhaps due to his overall health or some partial resistance. I estimated he had 12 to 18 hours before symptoms became obvious, perhaps 36 before full transformation. I didn't tell him immediately. Instead, I accelerated my work on the antibody treatment. The monitoring station had limited pharmaceutical supplies, but enough to attempt synthesizing a basic treatment using my antibodies as a template. If successful, it might slow Klaus's infection progression, buying time to reach more advanced facilities. By midnight, I had produced a rudimentary treatment and approached Klaus with the truth. To his credit, he responded with remarkable composure. As a hospital administrator, he understood infection protocols and the implications of his condition. He agreed to the experimental treatment while helping me secure him in a way that would protect me if it failed. We converted a storage closet into a containment room with water, food, and a communication device allowing us to speak without direct contact. I administered the treatment intravenously and began hourly monitoring of his vital signs and blood markers. The initial results were promising. His infection progression slowed significantly, though not halted entirely. If the trend continued, we might have extended his timeline from hours to days. That night, I made the difficult decision to leave the monitoring station. Military search patterns would find us soon, and our best chance for developing an effective treatment lay with reaching the CDC's mountain facility. Klaus insisted I go alone, taking all research materials and leaving him secured in the containment room with enough supplies for several days. If my treatment worked, it would buy him time until I could return with a more effective version. If it failed, the containment would ensure he didn't become a threat. It was his choice, a final act of humanity in the face of dehumanizing infection. Before dawn, I packed essential equipment, samples, and data into backpacks manageable for solo travel. The mountain facility was approximately 60 miles northeast, a journey that would require crossing infected territories and avoiding military patrols. As I prepared to leave, a priority alert came through the satellite communication system. The military had located several monitoring stations and was implementing sterilization protocols immediately. Our location was on the list, scheduled for targeting within 2 hours. There was no time for proper goodbyes. Klaus urged me to leave immediately, recognizing his life was already forfeit either to infection or military action. His final request was that I ensure his sacrifice meant something, that I reach the CDC with our research. I promised him I would, then left through the emergency exit as the first helicopter sounds echoed in the distance. The sun was just rising as I disappeared into the tree line, Sev circling overhead, guiding me toward paths unknown to both infected and military alike. I traveled for 3 days through increasingly dangerous terrain. The wilderness that had once been my sanctuary became a gauntlet of threats. Infected wildlife, wandering human infected, and military patrols implementing containment protocols with lethal efficiency. I moved primarily at night, using Sev as reconnaissance during daylight hours. What I witnessed from hidden observation points told a grim story of how quickly society had unraveled. Small towns overrun within hours. Military barricades established then abandoned. Survivor groups forming and fracturing, some turning to predatory behavior worse than the infected themselves. My wildlife training proved invaluable. I tracked infected movement patterns, noting they followed paths of least resistance just like uninfected animals. They congregated in areas with recent human activity and dispersed when resources, meaning uninfected humans, weren't found. Their behavior wasn't random, but followed predictable ecological patterns. On the 3rd day, I encountered a new development. A pack of infected moving in coordinated formation, led by what appeared to be a recently turned soldier still wearing tactical gear. They maintained regular spacing and responded to environmental stimuli as a unit rather than individuals. The pathogen was adapting, using the neural pathways and training of its hosts to create more efficient hunting behaviors. I avoided direct contact whenever possible, but twice I was forced to eliminate infected that detected me. I used a compound bow taken from an abandoned ranger station, silent and retrievable, Unlike my limited ammunition, each encounter reinforced what my research suggested. The infected retained procedural memory, but lost all higher cognitive functions. They could operate equipment they were familiar with before turning, but couldn't problem solve or adapt to new situations. By the fourth morning, I reached the foothills leading to the CDC mountain facility. According to emergency broadcasts, it was one of 12 secure research locations nationwide still operating under federal protection. If I could reach it with my samples and data, we might have a fighting chance at developing an effective treatment. The challenge was getting through their security perimeter without being mistaken for infected. I had no way to communicate in advance, and approaching openly risked being shot by nervous guards. I needed to find an alternative entry point. While scouting the facility from a distant ridge, I observed regular helicopter deliveries at a clearing 2 miles from the main entrance. Supply runs, presumably bringing resources and possibly evacuating personnel. If I could intercept one, I might secure passage inside. I positioned myself near the landing zone hours before the next scheduled arrival, hiding in dense undergrowth downwind from the clearing. When the helicopter approached, I noticed something unexpected. They were dropping supplies without landing. The packages descended on parachutes while the helicopter maintained altitude, never touching down. They were maintaining absolute isolation, which meant my plan wouldn't work. I needed another approach. The supply packages contained primarily medical equipment and food rations, but one crate held communication gear, including short-range radios tuned to frequencies the facility monitored. This gave me a way to make contact without approaching physically. I established communication with the facility security team, identifying myself and explaining the critical nature of my research. They were understandably suspicious, requiring verification of my identity and expertise. I provided details only a legitimate wildlife disease specialist would know and referenced CDC protocols specific to zoonotic outbreaks. After hours of negotiation, they agreed to send a small team to a designated pickup point, where I would undergo decontamination and medical screening before being granted access. The rendezvous was set for dawn the following day. That night, I organized my research materials and prepared the samples for transport. I had 6 vials of my blood showing immunity markers, 4 vials of extracted antibodies, tissue samples from various infected, and the complete data package from the research facility servers. Together, they told the story of the outbreak's origin and potentially held the key to fighting it. I reached the pickup point at first light. The extraction team arrived in hazmat suits, implementing strict containment protocols. They secured me in an isolation suit before allowing me to board their vehicle. My samples and research were sealed in specialized containment cases that would maintain their integrity during transport. The CDC mountain facility was more extensive than I'd anticipated, a complex built into the mountainside with multiple security layers. The main research areas existed several levels underground, protected from both infected and military strikes. Nearly 300 scientists and support personnel had been gathered here, working in specialized teams on different aspects of the outbreak. After medical clearance confirming I wasn't infected, I was brought to the research director, Dr. Eleanor Weiss, former head of the CDC's Emerging Zoonotic Diseases Division. She recognized my name immediately from publications we'd both contributed to on wildlife disease management. I shared everything, my observations, samples, and the server data revealing the outbreak's origins. The Agricultural Resilience Initiative had been a joint venture between a corporate agriculture giant and government research agencies designed to develop targeted biological controls for invasive species-threatening crop yields. The modified prion structure was engineered to affect specific neural pathways in target species, while theoretically remaining harmless to humans and beneficial wildlife. What the researchers hadn't anticipated was the prion's remarkable adaptability. When introduced to test environments, it mutated to affect non-target species. Rather than halting the program when these mutations were observed, project administrators accelerated testing under pressure from corporate partners focused on quarterly projections. The first wildlife infections appeared in testing regions throughout the national park system, deliberately chosen for their isolation. Researchers documented the spread through animal populations, but failed to recognize the danger until human cases emerged among park workers. By then, infected wildlife had migrated to populated areas, and human-to-human transmission had begun. Dr. Weiss confirmed my findings were consistent with their research. My blood samples showing immunity were particularly valuable, offering insights into potential treatment approaches. The antibody extract I developed was crude, but demonstrated the concept could work. With proper equipment and expertise, they could refine it into a more effective treatment. Most importantly, my server's data provided crucial information about the pathogen's original structure before mutation. This could potentially allow them to develop targeted treatments attacking the prion's fundamental architecture, rather than just symptoms. For the first time since the outbreak began, I felt genuine hope. The combined knowledge in this facility, enhanced by my field observations and samples, created a real possibility of developing effective countermeasures. Not a cure for those already turned, the neural damage was irreversible, but treatments preventing infection in the healthy and possibly slowing progression in recent exposures. Dr. Weiss assigned me to a research team focusing on immunity factors. My expertise in wildlife disease transmission provided valuable perspective on how the infection spread through different population dynamics. The patterns I'd observed in animal behavior helped predict how infected human groups would move and concentrate, information crucial for planning secure zones and evacuation corridors. It's been 5 days since I arrived at the facility. Our preliminary results are promising. We've synthesized an improved version of my antibody treatment that shows 78% effectiveness in preventing infection when administered before exposure. For recent exposures, it slows progression significantly, extending the treatment window from hours to days. The military has established a network of secure zones nationwide, focusing on areas with natural boundaries or defensible perimeters. Civilian evacuation continues where possible, prioritizing individuals with medical or scientific backgrounds that could contribute to recovery efforts. Perhaps most encouraging, the infection appears to have biological limitations we can exploit. The prion structure is unstable outside a host, degrading within hours in most environments. Infected individuals eventually suffer complete neural collapse approximately 30 days after transformation, meaning the infected population will naturally decline without new hosts. This gives us a critical window. If we can protect enough uninfected humans for the next 2 months, the initial wave of infected will largely collapse. Combined with our developing treatments and stricter containment, we could reach a tipping point where recovery becomes possible. I'm recording this broadcast to share what I've learned with survivor groups beyond our communication network. The facility has granted permission to transmit on emergency frequencies, hoping to reach isolated pockets of resistance with information that might save lives. If you're receiving this, know that survival is possible. The infected follow predictable patterns. They're drawn to noise, movement, and light. They concentrate in previously populated areas and disperse when food sources aren't found. They can't problem solve but retain procedural memory from before transformation. Most importantly, they eventually degrade without new hosts. Humanity has faced pandemics before and survived. This one is more aggressive, more frightening in its effects, but ultimately subject to the same biological constraints as any pathogen. It can be fought, it can be contained, and with continued research it can be overcome. I don't know if Klaus survived at the monitoring station. I don't know if Jackson's group reached safety. But their sacrifices, like those of countless others, have contributed to the knowledge that might save our species. In their names, we continue the work. This is Dante Flint Blackwell, broadcasting from CDC Mountain Research Facility. We are still here, we are still fighting, and we have hope. If you can reach us safely, we welcome your help. If not, use this information to protect yourselves and others. Humanity endures, even in its darkest hour. Stay safe, stay smart, stay human.